and my name is Brooke Donald, and I direct communications at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. So thank you all for joining us today. We'll bring Tom and Sean into the conversation in just a minute, but I just wanted to let you know how this is going to go. So Tom is going to give a brief overview of the project, and Sean will also go over some of the data. And then once they do that, we'll open it up for questions and also show you a little bit about how the website works. And so the website I just wanted to call your attention to is educationrecoveryscorecard.org. You'll be able to find maps and see trends from your district and be able to report out from there. So let me turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Brooke, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So as you know, the nation's report card came out this week and reported large losses in achievement scores in almost every state. But public health officials could not have fought off the pandemic with only state-level counts of COVID infections, and parents and school leaders will not be able to help their students catch up without knowing how their children have been affected. That's why we are providing the first high-resolution map of how the pandemic affected individual school districts and student subgroups across the country. As we're seeing, the pandemic was like a band of tornadoes, leaving devastating learning losses in some districts while leaving many other districts untouched. But until now, that damage has been hard to see, especially for parents. Now that students are back in school, polls show 90% or more of parents believe their children are on grade level. But parents need to know what they don't know, and that what these data hopefully will help them see is that students in many districts are far behind where they should be in terms of learning the content for their grade level. When test scores, state test scores began to emerge this summer, showing disturbing signs of achievement losses, our team at Harvard reached out to Sean Reardon at Stanford and began assembling the data from these state student assessments. The problem for us and for all of you in reporting on those state test results is that it's impossible to compare changes in proficiency rates from one state to another, or even from one grade or subject to another. Starting back in August, we began assembling all these state test score data we could find, knowing that the National Assessment of Educational Progress results would be coming out this week. You see, we have had October 24th, the day of the NAEP release, etched on our calendars for a few months now, because once those state scores came out, we had what we needed to translate all the state test score data for every school district and every student subgroup and put them on the same scale so that parents, governors, mayors, local district leaders could finally see the extent of the damage district by district across the country. We finally had the local level measures of COVID impacts we needed to manage the recovery, just like public health officials use local data to manage the response to the pandemic itself. When they look at the data at the Education Recovery Scorecard site, many communities are going to learn that their school district's recovery plans are not commensurate with their student losses. We're not blaming anyone. That's to be expected, given that we're just now measuring those losses on a grade level scale, telling every district how many grade levels their students lost during the pandemic. The good thing is this districts still have a large amount of federal funding still unspent. We urge parents, school boards, mayors, school district leaders to look at these data, look at the research on the efficacy of various interventions, such as tutoring or summer school or school vacation academies, and assemble a plan, like a package of interventions which will help students catch up. Back in the early 1960s, when President Kennedy issued the Moon Challenge, NASA's rocket engineers calculated the thrust they would need to send 3 humans, a lunar module, life support systems, and enough fuel for the round trip to the moon. They realized they needed a whole new rocket design, hence the Saturn V rocket. What many districts are doing now is effectively shooting bottle rockets at the moon, launching small-scale interventions which are directionally correct, but won't add up to anything sufficient to help students catch up. We hope that these data lead local communities to reassess those plans and envision a much more ambitious recovery effort involving more than just schools, but community organizations, parents, libraries, local universities, in using the federal dollars to help students catch up. I'm now going to turn it over to Sean Reardon at Stanford to explain the methodology for putting these district test scores on the same scale. I'll then pick up later to discuss results. So Sean.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm Sean Reardon. I'm a professor of education at Stanford University. And as Tom said, we've been working for the last few months to try to assemble and analyze these data to provide a highly localized picture of patterns of education achievement and changes in achievement over the last 3 years. So our goal is to be able to measure achievement at a local scale in every district and then compare those changes in test scores to characteristics of districts so that we can identify which districts and what kinds of districts and what characteristics of things that have happened to the districts over the last few years were most related to changes in learning for students. And as Tom said, we hope that information informs policymakers, educators, community leaders, families about where and how efforts to reduce those inequalities are most needed to ensure that the effects of the pandemic aren't permanent. So the challenge with doing this, as Tom alluded to, is that each state administers different standardized tests in grades through grade than other states. And in some cases, those tests change over time. And so that makes comparing test scores patterns from one year to the next or from one state to the next difficult or in some cases impossible. So we can use the state tests to compare within a state, but we often can't use them well to compare across time or between states. So the way we've solved this problem is we use the state assessments to compare the performance of districts within a state, and then we use the results of the NAEP assessment to measure the differences in performance between states, and we stitch those two sets of results together to enable us to make comparisons among all districts in the US. Essentially, we use the state test to say, how different is your district from your state average? And we use NAEP to say, how different is your state average from the national average? And by putting those together, we're able to put the state assessments onto a common scale that lets us make comparisons, not just within a state, but within a state over time and across states. We also are able to use the NAEP assessments to rescale state test scores into approximate grade level equivalents so that we can put these results into a scale that's more interpretable to policymakers, to parents, to community leaders. So instead of talking about test scores in terms of standard deviations or something, which or NAEP points, which aren't really highly interpretable, we translate them into grade levels. So if we say that test scores declined by 1 grade level between 2019 and 2022, that means that students who were in 4th grade, say in 2022, had test scores on average that were 1 grade level lower than students in the same grade 3 years prior. So that provides a kind of comparable metric. So here's a map. I'll show you more detail about the interactive features of the map a little later, but here's a map of the states and districts where we have data for. We have data for 29 states. And in most of those states, we have data from districts enrolling the vast majority of children. And in small districts, we often don't have enough data to make valid comparisons. But this covers about half of the 3rd through 8th grade population in the US, about 12 million students. So using these data, we're able to look at the patterns of achievement losses and changes from 2019 to 2022 over all the districts that we have in those states. And NAEP showed us that on average, students lost about a half grade level nationally in math, and that varies somewhat across states, but it actually varies much more dramatically across districts than it does even across states. So if you look at the figure on the left, that shows us that the median student, the middle student in these states, was in a district where the average student lost about a half a grade level, 0.52 grade levels. But that average masks substantial variation. So about 5% of students were in districts that lost a grade level or more. Another 2% of students were in districts where there were actually no losses or even slight gains. So the patterns across district vary dramatically. The same general pattern is true for reading, though on average, the losses were only about half as large for reading as they were for math, about a quarter of a grade level on average, with about 1% of students in districts losing a grade level or more, and about 15% of students in districts losing or gaining ground, actually. So there's enormous variation, but the variation is not sort of randomly distributed among school districts. So if we look, for example, at the large districts in Massachusetts, you can see that in districts like Andover, Arlington, Natick, Newton, some of the more affluent districts in Massachusetts, test scores declined by roughly a third of a grade level on average. Those are the most affluent districts. But in some of the large and high poverty districts like Fall River, Revere, Lowell, Springfield, and so on, the losses were much greater, on the order of a whole grade level. The same is true in Georgia. If we look at large districts in Georgia, the biggest losses were concentrated in the highest poverty districts in Georgia, Atlanta, DeKalb, and places like that. If we look at the same pattern nationally, instead of within a state, we see the same thing. That is, on average, high poverty districts experience much larger losses in math and to some extent in reading skills than low poverty districts. A sort of typical low poverty district lost about 0.45 of a grade level in math. The typical high poverty district lost 2/3 of a grade level in math. And the same sort of pattern is true in reading, though not quite as pronounced. And one way to think about this is that what it means is that the effects of the pandemic were disproportionately visited on students in the highest poverty districts. And so what that means is the pandemic exacerbated the already existing educational inequality between high and low income communities in the United States. And so part of what we need to do as we think about recovery is figure out not just how to move everyone up, but how to move up the children in the highest poverty districts even more so that we can undo that exacerbation of inequality that was created by the pandemic. I'm going to hand it to Tom, I think, to say something about the next few slides.
So many of you and many parents out there have been focused on the role played by remote instruction during 2021. And what our results are suggesting is that while districts that were closed for longer did see larger losses on average, it was actually, not the only factor, and maybe not even the primary factor driving these achievement losses. Yes, there, on the left, we just portray what were the average achievement losses by the percent of the year that states were remote, and you can see that the state with the highest average percent of the year during 2021 remote, California, actually had losses smaller than a lot of states that were closed for much less time, as this map shows, graph shows on the left. On the right, we show what that looked like within a state, and the same thing was true, that yes, the districts that spent more time remote relative to their state average had somewhat bigger losses. There was tremendous variation around it, so that even some districts that were closed for much longer than the average district in their state saw smaller losses than districts that were closed for much shorter times in the state. So it's clear that while there is some evidence that remote instruction played a role, it was clearly not the only factor. One big question that we all ought to be asking, because remember, the American Rescue Plan was passed before anybody knew like what was the magnitude of these losses. We all ought to be asking, like, what's the recovery going to cost? And have we provided enough resources to districts to catch up? And so we've been doing some thinking about that. And one approach to thinking about it is to calculate, okay, well, what percent of a year did a district miss? So for instance, Boston, if you average together the math achievement losses and the reading achievement losses, they lost about 60% of a school year. Well, what will the recovery cost? Well, we'd say that a lower bound estimate is that it would cost, well, 59% of their pre-pandemic instructional budget, because it's not going to be, remember, this 59% in additional learning has to happen on top of the typical learning over the next couple of years. And it's not going to be cheaper to generate that 59% of learning on top of traditional learning with things like tutoring and after school and summer school than it does during a typical school year to operate schools with traditional class sizes. So we're saying, okay, well, to make up 59% of a school year, it's going to cost at least 59% of a pre-pandemic instructional budget. Well, what's Boston's AR funding under the American Rescue Plan? They received about $5,500 per student. Boston's instructional budget is about $15,000 per student. That means that the American Rescue Plan is providing about 35% of the pre-pandemic instructional budget. If you just subtract the two, you'd infer that the recovery is likely to cost more than Boston's ARP funding, because they lost 59% of a school year. They've received the equivalent of 35% of a school year's instructional budget, leaving a deficit of about 0.24. So if we were to plot Boston's point on this line, we'd infer that Boston was about negative 0.24 of their instructional budget behind. But then if we plot this for everybody, all school districts, if we were to fill in the other districts here, we'd discover that 65% of students nationally were in districts where the recovery is likely to cost more than the ARP funding. So before we shift to open up for questions, I just wanted to briefly introduce you to the project website. So it's at Education Recovery Scorecard.org. If you go to that site, you'll find some media resources, including the document with just some of the key findings. So all the slides that we've just been going through are in this local achievement impacts of the pandemic document. There's also a press release and some additional research, for instance, on, we've been looking at, okay, so these are test score declines. How worried should we be about this? And there's a study that looks at the relationship between test scores and earnings and educational attainment. And we have some additional resources there under the key findings section. in recovery efforts, we highlight some of the other efforts going on around the country in terms of helping folks catch up. And under expert voices, we provide some links to comments from other folks leading recovery efforts and from civil rights organizations such as Unidos US and the Education Trust. Now, on the website, there's also this cool interactive map that I'll let Sean take you through.
Great. Tom, if you stop sharing your screen, I'll share mine so I can navigate the map.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I've stopped. Are you
There? Can you guys see the map?
Yep.
Okay. So if you click on the map in the website Tom just showed you, it will take you to the interactive version of the map here, and so you can see here two things I want to point out is, or a couple of things I want to point out actually. So one is if you come to the upper left up here, you can look at changes in math scores or changes in reading scores, or you can just look at what the scores were in either subject in either year. So I'm going to keep it on the math scores here. And then you can look at the map and you can hover over the map and zoom in and highlight, any district you want and get information about it. If you click on a district, you get this panel on the left that tells you what the change in math and reading scores were in that district, as well as what they were in each year, and then tells you information about how those changes varied by subgroups. So you can sort of drill down and get more information by clicking on a district. You can also look at the data in chart form. So if you click up here on the upper right, you can choose the map, the chart, or both of them at the same time. And on the chart, you can see here, it's showing you the percent of free and reduced price lunch eligibility in a school district. You can also look at this by percent of remote learning or ESSER funds available. And then on the vertical axis, it's showing what the average change in math score was. And you can see, for example, just to sort of read this chart, is that, on average, places that had low poverty rates had learning losses around, on average, probably around a half a grade level. But among those that are the highest poverty, the learning losses were larger on average, around 2/3 to one grade level. You can also search for a place. So if I search up here, say for Charlotte, I can find Charlotte-Mecklenburg and click on that. And then that will highlight Charlotte-Mecklenburg on the chart. It will bring up the information about it there. You could also, you can filter. If you go to left here and go to data filters, you can just look for, say, all the districts within California, if you just wanted to focus on those in a particular state. And then the chart will just show the California districts. So you can see in California, we know from NAEP that California test scores declined by not as much as they did in many other states. In the most affluent places in California, actually test scores didn't decline much at all. So Cupertino and San Ramon and places like this, they're more affluent. Whereas in the highest poverty places in California, scores declined by 2/3 of a grade level or so on average. So by drilling down into an individual state or district, you can learn a lot more information. Two other features that you might be interested in. One is in this lower right, there's a little button here to embed the map or chart. And if you click on that, it will give you HTML code that will let you embed the interactive version of this chart in any web page. So if you wanted to include a chart or a map in a publication online, you can just use that link to get the HTML code to embed it. And finally, for those of you who want to look at the actual data, if you come up here to the menu on the right side and go down to get the data, it'll take you to a page where you can download the data files, where you can, and you can get them in a Excel or CSV format and sort them how you want and look for districts with particularly high or low changes. You can also do that, by looking at the charts and sort of clicking on places that are interesting to you. So that's a very quick tour of the website. Happy to answer questions about the website, but more generally about the substance of the findings we had. I think we'll open it up now to questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Thank you, both Tom and Sean. So we've gotten a lot of questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of them. And you can continue to send us questions. And for some of you, thank you so much for putting your organization in the chat as well. We will be sending this recording out to everyone who registered after this is done. So a quick question from one guest is Howard Bloom at the LA Times is, can we sort these results like in an Excel file to find the districts at the extremes? He also asked that you please go over how to look up a district, but we just did that. I just want to make sure that we're airing the questions because this is a bunch of reporters. So I think the real question is, how do you find the extremes? And I think, Sean, maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. I think one way to do that is to download the data and sort them in an Excel file. But I think an easier way to do that is to look at the charts on the website. And then you can just look for places that are high on the chart that had more positive changes, and then places that are low on the chart that had more stronger declines. And if you just hover over those places, you can see what places they were. So that's probably the easiest way to do it, though you can also download the data and do it that way.
And just a follow-up on that, which high poverty districts are positive outliers in California? Are you able to answer that?
I would say Compton stands out a little bit as having, a slightly smaller decline, more, on the order of 0.4 grade levels compared to something like 2/3 to 3/4 for most high poverty districts. But you could sort of explore in more detail on the website to identify individual places. And
thank you. And Kaylin, and I'm sorry if I'm saying anybody's name wrong, but Kaylin from Chalkbeat asks, what other data would you say needs to be researched to better understand the relationship between whether schools were open for in-person learning and how that affected student learning? For instance, the share of students who actually returned, what instruction looked like in schools.
I think it's important not to take the correlation that we find between the percent of time that schools were remote and learning losses as clear evidence of a causal relationship between those two things. That is, the school districts that were remote more of the time may have differed in other ways than school districts that were less remote. They may have had higher case rates, more death. They may have had more sickness among teaching staff. So they may have differed in other ways that might have affected students' learning independent of whether the school districts were closed. So to really sort of tease out whether it was remote learning or not, we'd need to know a lot more about the districts in order to make sort of fair apples to apples comparisons between very similar districts, some that were more remote and some that were less remote. So while descriptively the pattern is true that more remote districts had larger learning losses, that's not to say that the cause of those larger learning losses was solely due to remote learning. Remember, even in places that were in person all year, still on average had very large learning losses on the order of 1/3 to 1/2 of a grade level. Those were larger in higher remote places, but everywhere on average saw learning losses. So I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the pandemic affected all aspects of children's lives. So it affected their families, their family incomes. Their parents might have lost jobs. They might have had sickness in the family or even death in the family. Their teachers may have been affected in the same ways. Children were socially isolated. They weren't able to see their friends. They were probably often quite scared of what was happening and not understanding it. So think of all the sort of stress because of changing family circumstances, economic circumstances, social isolation. All of those things affected children's ability to be able to learn, not just whether or not their schools were teaching remotely or in person. And so while the remote learning is probably a piece of the story, it's probably a small piece of all the ways that the pandemic affected children's outcomes.
So I was part of a team that last spring used the NWEA assessment data to study the impact of of remote instruction on students' learning gains on NWEA. But I have to say, I was really surprised by these results, that we didn't see bigger differences between districts that were remote. And like these results that we've seen have really opened my eyes to the point that Sean was just making, is that even though there is, I mean, our earlier data, I think, is actually stronger evidence that remote instruction played a role. In some ways, these data aren't ideal for testing that question, but I was still very struck by just the huge variation in losses among districts that were remote the same amount of time. That you know, based on the discussion before these results came out, you'd think that the only thing driving achievement losses would be remote learning, but actually that does not seem to be the case. It seems like there were many other things, and over the next few weeks, Sean and we will be looking at what role other things may have played. For instance, you know, broadband connectivity by district, COVID death rates by district, the kinds of jobs parents, industries and occupations that parents held, differences by district. So hopefully we'll learn more, but I think at this point we can say it wasn't just remote instruction driving these losses. There were as Sean was saying, there are lots of other things.
So a lot of the questions do have to do with remote instruction and remote learning. So we will get back to those. I just want to make sure I'm ticking off some of the other questions that are coming in, because I do think from the answers that Tom and Sean just gave, that does cover some of these other questions about remote learning, but we will go back to them. So there's also questions about defining free and reduced lunch, because some states and the federal government ordered that during the pandemic, free and reduced lunch was given to everyone. So there were some questions about how you use that data. I just want to let people know that Tyler Patterson, who's been answering some of the questions in the chat, is one of the research analysts on the project. So if you need to reference him at all, that would be his title. Okay, so Sean or Tom, would you like to answer some, what did you use for free and reduced lunch? And then there's a specific question that comes in from West Virginia, Ryan Quinn, and he says West Virginia is one of the top states using the community eligibility provision, which means most of our school districts had district-wide free and reduced lunch even before the pandemic. So it's not a very good indicator of poverty here. How was that accounted for in the data?
Great question. Yeah, the community eligibility provision complicates the measurement of poverty rates in schools, as you obviously know, and many of you know. So what we've done is we have used other data about school districts to try to get a better estimate of the free and reduced lunch eligibility rate in school districts by using data from earlier years in the same district or data from the American Community Survey to try to estimate the poverty rate in a district or the free and reduced lunch rate in a district when a school or a district has most of its students classified as eligible under community eligibility. So the numbers you see on our website for free and reduced lunch eligibility don't always match the publicly reported free and reduced lunch eligibility numbers, because we try to correct them or get a better estimate in cases where it's community eligibility. The other thing we have, and it's not on this version of the website, is we have census and American Community Survey data that lets us get actually a much richer measure of socioeconomic conditions in the district. And we'll be adding that to the website going forward as an alternative measure of socioeconomic conditions in a district.
And Sean, I think we also need to explain that these measures are all based on pre-pandemic.
Right. Yeah, these are all based on data from 2019, free and reduced lunch eligibility, so that we're not confounding changes in poverty rates with the effects of the pandemic. Good point.
Thank you. Let's see here. Do you, there's another question about insights or ideas about why the difference between high poverty and more affluent districts in grade level loss was bigger in math than in reading. I don't know if your data can tell you anything about that, but Tom, maybe you have some insight there.
So traditionally, when people have studied the efficacy of various kinds of interventions, we typically see bigger impacts in math than in literacy. And so, and remember, we're focusing here on changes. So, so to the extent that lower income students in lower income schools are relying more on the instruction that they're receiving in schools to learn math, we'll see bigger impacts in math than in literacy, where it's not just schools, but it's schools and families playing a role. So math seems to be more, in lots of cases, seems to be more sensitive to changes in what's happening in school than reading has been historically.
Sean, is there anything else to add, or?
No, I would just echo Tom's point. I mean, I think the more that students were remote, the more that they were relying on their parents to help them with schoolwork. And reading to children is much more universal across the socioeconomic spectrum, and parents are often feel better equipped to help their children with reading than math. And that's particularly true of parents who did well, who didn't do well in school themselves, and so more affluent parents typically did better in school themselves and often feel more comfortable helping their children with math than families that didn't do well in school themselves. And so I think it's the interaction of sort of parenting, relying more on parents for schooling resources that drives, I think, some of that difference that we see between math and reading in the association with remote learning.
Okay, we have a question about translating the test scores into grade levels. Can you explain that a bit more in detail about how you create the grade level changes based on the test scores?
Sure. Yeah. In brief, what we are able to do is we use, as I said, we use the NAEP data to sort of put the state assessments onto the same common scale. We put them onto the NAEP scale, and the NAEP assessments are given in 4th and 8th grade. And on average, scores among 4th graders nationally are about 40 points lower than scores among 8th graders nationally. So you can think of 40 points as the difference between 4th and 8th grade nationally. So that's about 10-point difference per grade. So we consider roughly a 10-point difference in NAEP points to be roughly a grade level of difference. We check that with a lot of other data that supports that. And so we're able to kind of use that NAEP scaling to tell us sort of how many NAEP points relates to a kind of average student's nationally grade level of learning. And then we can translate the test scores into those NAEP points and then back into grade levels of learning. So it relies really on NAEP to kind of turn the scores into grade levels. But when we validate that using other data sources where we can actually follow the same kids over time and see how much they learn, we get a very similar answer for how much test points corresponds to a grade level of learning.
Okay, from the Kansas Reflector, we're going to go back to learning loss based on remote learning. Rachel asks, in states where there were no shutdowns, like Florida and South Dakota, were education losses significantly lessened? Tom, do you want to take that?
So I'm just trying to, Florida and Texas did see smaller losses than the average loss across the country, at least in math. But there were some other states that were in remote instruction for a much longer share of the year than Florida and Texas that saw similar declines. So the average, the state averages do sort of match what or at least in Florida and Texas match what we would have expected, that they had somewhat smaller declines than the national average, but there was definitely not a one-to-one correspondence between the share of the year schools were remote in a state and the magnitude of their losses. Like the one clear outlier was California, as I said before, that had smaller losses than most other states, and yet they were remote the longest on average.
Tom, I'm just sharing the Explorer where you can sort of see this pattern. That one of the other things you can do on the Explorer is look at the data by state, not just by district. And so this is just really just re-showing NAEP data. But if we look at learning losses by percent of the year remote, this is Florida and this is Texas. This is California. So you can see in math, the learning losses were actually slightly smaller in California than Texas and Florida. In reading, I think they're pretty similar. Here's Texas and Florida and California. So the big states that had very different patterns, as Tom said, didn't see dramatically different changes in learning loss, though some of the smaller states that did have more remote learning did see. So the pattern at the state level doesn't map very clearly onto the percent of the year that students were in remote learning.
So these maps, this slide is showing for the states we currently have.
Right.
There were some additional high states with lots.
No, this is actually all 50 states, Tom. Sorry, this is every state, because this is based on NAEP data.
Okay, so it's got Delaware and New Mexico and
there's Delaware.
Okay. Yeah, so there were some states that had high closures, Virginia, Oregon, Maryland, that had high closures and high losses. It's
right.
Just it was not a one-to-one relationship.
I think one of the key words in the question was, were there significant losses? And I think I've heard both of you talk about can you talk about whether losses were significant or not because of remote? I think what you're saying is,
well, there were certainly states where they were significant. I mean, they were down in all, virtually every state except a couple, in Maryland and Oregon and Virginia, places like that, they were down, 3/4 of a grade level in reading and far more than that in math. So those are very significant, but whether that's caused by the fact that students were remote or not isn't clear, because you also have other places that were, sort of similarly remote at high levels that had smaller losses. And so attaching the losses simply to the percent of time that students were remote versus in-person instruction misses some of the substantial variation among places that even had similar rates of remote learning.
So a really quick thing that I think would be nice for you to define. We got a question about lumping all remote instruction into one category. And I just thought that just made me think that maybe we should just quickly define what we mean by remote, since there's different definitions. Sean?
Tom, actually, do you want to talk about the AEI
Yes.
data that comes from?
So we use two different measures. We combine two different measures of remote instruction here. I mean, as the question implies, actually, the quality of remote instruction is also likely one of the things that underlies the variation that we're seeing. But the specific measure that we're using comes from the main measure comes from the Return to Learn tracker at American Enterprise Institute that covers the vast majority of districts with 3 or more schools in the country. For smaller districts or districts for which we were missing the Return to Learn tracker data, we used data from Emily Oster's COVID-19 School Data Hub website. The definition the two use is a little bit different. So the American Enterprise Institute definition of remote instruction is when schools were closed, where there was no option of in-person instruction. Emily Oster's, the one that we used when the school date, when the Return to Learn tracker was missing, is based on were the majority of students in person or remote. And so they're a little bit different concepts. It turns out when there was an option to be in person, the majority of parents were in person. So usually these two line up, but the concept is a little bit different. We're not these measures are not picking up like quality of remote instruction. And in fact, I think just as a field, we're missing measures of the quality of remote instruction. Maybe we can pick some of that up by adding in data on the percentage of households that have broadband access.
Okay, so one thing I just wanted to raise up, though it has been answered in our Q&A, is that we will be adding more states as they come in. So do you have any indication of when, or is there a pattern to the updates, anything like that? Or just when they drop, they drop?
So I think when they drop, they drop. Like I think in the past, just based on past state releases, we're expecting to have the rest of the states by the end of the calendar year. So we hope this will be close to complete by the end of December. Sean, we haven't agreed on just how frequently we're going to be updating these data yet. We've been so focused on getting this first batch out, but weekly or bi-weekly or something.
Yeah, I would expect we'll update it several more times in November as states become available, and some states have reached out to ask how, what data we need to include them. So we're hoping that we'll be able to add more over the next month or so.
Yeah, so as Sean says, like there are a couple of states on there, I'm just thinking in particular of Ohio, that have released some results. It's just that we don't have all the fields that Sean needs to generate the district level estimates. So there are a few states that have released results that are still gray on our map, and so we'll be working with them to try to get the additional data we need to generate these estimates. And then hopefully the remaining states that haven't publicly released any results yet will fill in.
Great. So I want to recognize the time, and just I think we've gone through most of the questions. If anything else comes up while you're searching through the Education Recovery Scorecard, then you can definitely reach out to me or my counterpart at Harvard, whose name is Lindsay Blauvelt, and you should have received her number on a press release, and it's also on the website. I also wanted to note that the historical data is for all districts is available on Sean's Educational Opportunity Project website, and you can find those links on the Education Recovery Scorecard website. So if you want to look back beyond 2019. So Sean and Tom, I just want to give you an opportunity before we close out to say the kinds of questions that you hope communities will be able to ask or answer based on this new data. Tom, why don't you lead us off?
So the most important thing right now is that districts take a look at the magnitude of these losses, look at the evidence on the efficacy of each of the interventions that they're doing, like high dosage tutoring or summer school, and then do like the equivalent of what the NASA thrust calculation would be, and that is to say, okay, what percentage of kids are getting this intervention? What's the effect size we should expect? And then let's add them up across interventions. I think what a lot of districts are going to find when they do that, at least every district whose plans I've looked at so far will find, is that what they're planning is just not sufficient to make up for the magnitude of these losses. Think about it. The average kid missed half a year of learning in math. And we're not going to make up for half a year of learning with a few extra days of instruction or by providing tutors to 5 or 10% of kids. Like it's just, I can do the calculations with the efficacy research, but to some extent, it's just common sense. And so I would just urge districts to take a fresh look at their plans now that we have these data on the magnitude of their achievement losses. Because if they wait and they say, okay, well, let's just wait and see how the spring 23 assessments go. Based on what I've seen, what they're going to find out, but they'll find it out pretty late, is that they way underdid it this year, and that if things keep going on the track they're on, they're going to find out in late summer 23 or early fall 23 that, wow, kids are still way behind. The problem is at that point, there's only one more school year, the 23-24 school year, to spend the federal recovery dollars. So it's important to get started now. Don't wait for the spring 23 state test results to come back to say kids are still way behind. Use these data to reconsider plans for the spring and for next summer.
Thank you, Tom. And Sean, one question just came in that I just want to get in there before you wrap things up. Is a reporter's asking, is there, and this is such a great reporter question, is there a story angle that hasn't been covered yet that you would like to see covered? And I have some guesses about what you're going to say based on what you do for a living, but why don't you go for it?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would agree entirely with Tom about what districts need to be doing and thinking about and strategizing. But I want to sort of step back and call attention to a couple other things. So one is to think about test scores and declines in test scores as a symptom of probably a much larger constellation of ways that children were harmed by the pandemic. That is, if we had systematic measures of kids' mental health and well-being, and sense of safety in the world, for example, we probably would see similarly sizable declines across the board, some variation across places as well. But test scores aren't the only way in which children were harmed by the pandemic, and I think it's important not to reduce or sort of focus only on the test scores as the way the pandemic hurt children. Secondly, I think it's important to remember that these test score declines were caused not just by children's schooling experiences and whether they were remote or not, or the mode of instruction or the quality of instruction, but they were caused by lots of other features of the pandemic that affected every aspect of kids' lives. And so these are both a symptom of a larger sort of set of consequences, and they're caused by a larger set of sources than just schooling. So it's important to kind of, I think of these as a way we can see that damage that was done to kids and how it varied across places, but to think of it as not just a schooling story. And the third thing I think is key to keep in mind is how unequally felt the impacts of the pandemic were, where I think the patterns when we look at it by poverty show that children in affluent communities didn't emerge unscathed, but were much less scathed. It's not really a word, but we're much less harmed by the pandemic than children in more disadvantaged communities. And that inequality is not something an individual district can fix on its own. So in addition to, as Tom says, needing individual districts to kind of think strategically and smartly about how to use the resources they have, we also need state and federal leaders to be thinking about how do we make sure that the children in the communities that were most harmed by the pandemic have the resources in schools, but also, mental health resources and economic resources for their families and things like that, that are going to help those kids make up all the ground they lost, so that we don't end up with a kind of permanently larger amount of inequality than we had before the pandemic. So I think thinking about the distribution of impacts means we also need to think about the distribution of strategies and resources that we provide as a society for kids. And those have to be through schools, but also through other kinds of social service agencies.
And I think Tom had one last thing before we go.
So here is the most important, I think, most intriguing thing that has not been covered yet. And that is just I alluded to this at the beginning, is the disconnect between parents' perception and the magnitude of the losses we're seeing. 90+% of parents think their kid is currently at or above grade level. Yet what we just told you is the average student lost half a grade level. And I think it's really important to cover that, because that parent perception is an important constraint on district action. So no district leader is going to be able to propose potentially unpopular things like using school vacation weeks for additional instruction, or extending the school year, or extending the school day, if parents think kids are fine. And I think that I'm not blaming parents. I'm just saying my hypothesis for reconciling the two is that parents have what they see is their kid coming home from school happy or happy to go to school. My 16-year-old, I judge by just how hard he is to wake up in the morning to go to school. But that's a very limited measure. What I have very little visibility into, and most parents have very little visibility into, is whether or not their child is currently covering grade level standards. Are they currently covering what they should be given their grade level? And parents ought to be asking those kinds of questions. And because, as I said, that is the major constraint on more ambitious activity right now. I actually think it's less about dollars and more about common sense of urgency. And that's one of the things we're trying to solve, with providing better data.
All right, well, we're at 9 o'clock Pacific time. We're actually at 9:01. So I want to let y'all go. Like I said, this has been recorded. And if you do have additional questions, you can always email me. And I will try to get those to Tom or Sean. And so thank you very much for your interest. Again, go to educationrecoveryscorecard.org, check it out, and let us know your impressions. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.